Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to um, uh, the webinar on uh, COP30, the global polluters versus the world's people. And uh, First, a few words about uh, Institute for Policy Studies. We are a multi-issue progressive think tank that has been around for decades now, starting from the early 1960s. Um, we work on a wide range of issues, including economic justice and inequality, and peace and demilitarization, and of course, climate justice. And a big focus of our climate justice program is fighting the fossil fuel industry and its allies in government. And as part of that, we are very closely involved in what's called the fast, full, fair, funded, and feminist, or 5F fossil fuel phase out campaign. Now, it's quite a mouthful, but there's a relatively straightforward explanation of each of these terms. Uh, a global fossil fuel phase out needs to be fast. It needs to be on a timeline consistent with science, because science says we need to phase out fossil fuels rapidly to keep global temperature rise within safe levels. It needs to be full, meaning every little bit of fossil fuel use needs to be phased out. We cannot continue fossil fuel usage with gimmicks such as capturing emitted carbon and storing it in the ground, or through forest offset programs, all of which have been proven to be scams. Similarly, a fossil fuel phase out needs to be funded. What this means is that wealthy global north countries who are disproportionately responsible for the crisis need to pay their fair share. They need to pay global south countries in order for the global south countries to be able to transition from producing and consuming fossil fuels. And this is not charity, this is responsibility. Um, Likewise, a fossil fuel phase out needs to be fair. It needs to be a just transition for workers and communities and entire countries whose livelihoods and local, regional, and national economies are dependent upon fossil fuel usage for no fault of their own. Because ultimately, it's the wealthy global north countries and mega corporations who are responsible for the crisis. And finally, it needs to be feminist. It needs to recognize that the fossil fuel economy is rooted in patriarchy, and we need to transition from that model to a model of care, a model of collective solidarity, which is, grounded in feminist principles. And We're very happy to be joined by a distinguished panel of movement organizers and comrades. I'll introduce them as I call upon them to speak. And without further ado, I am going to pass it on to Sriram Madhusudanan, who's the Director of Policy and Advocacy at the US Climate Action Network, or USCAN.
Thank you so much, Basav. And yes, grateful to be here this afternoon or evening, depending on which time zone you all are in, with you all and with this really impressive panel. So I think, what I'm going to do is just kind of give a little bit of context of going into Brazil and COP30, sort of what the state of play was for climate policy in this moment. And I think that the real kind of takeaway that I want folks to be thinking about here is I think in the US in particular, there's certainly, rightfully so, been a lot of coverage of the climate wrecking impacts of the Trump administration and the fossil fuel billionaires and corporations that have been behind and driving and profiteering from that agenda. But really, when we look at how the US has shown up at the international stage for not just this year, but many years, we have been really doing a far less than our fair share of climate action. Certainly on the pillars of which Bossab really just talked about there in terms of the 5F campaign and what it's been calling for. But before I get into that, just a little bit of an introduction to US Climate Action Network. So we're the largest network of climate and environmental justice organizations in the US, and a US node of Climate Action Network International. And our mission is to urgently drive bold and equitable climate action that we so urgently need. So we believe that climate action must be rooted in justice. And let me just take a second to explain what climate justice means in that context, right? Particularly in the international context. And Basso spoke to this a little bit, but just to dig in a little bit more, there's a basic acknowledgement when we say climate justice of the deep and systemic injustices of the climate crisis. So the vast majority of people around the world, and indeed even in countries like the United States who are feeling the most severe impacts of the climate crisis, have done little to cause it. I mean, let's just take the example of ExxonMobil as one of the mega corporations that has profiteered immensely from selling and producing fossil fuels, has known for decades of the climate warming impacts, of the global warming impacts of the very product that they were creating. And they've worked tirelessly to ensure that those profits were not undermined or attacked. Not only this, but we believe that those who are most responsible for fueling the climate crisis, these mega corporations and indeed the countries that have been backing this agenda for too long, have an obligation to fix the problem. So who's responsible for fueling the climate crisis? When we look at the global stage, the countries of the global north, specifically here I'm talking about the United States, the UK, the European Union, Australia, Canada, are responsible for the majority of historical emissions. Carbon dioxide that is still in the atmosphere today. Some 23 countries, which represent about 12% of the world's population, have polluted more than the remaining 88%. So this is at a macro level, right? I talked a little bit about the role of the fossil fuel industry, corporations like Exxon, BP, Shell in driving this. And we've also got to consider the outsized climate footprints and investments of the ultra rich that all have played a role in perpetuating this fundamental and systemic inequality. So if this is our starting point and justice must be served, then we have to recognize that those who have caused the climate crisis bear the responsibility and indeed the obligation for fixing and repairing that harm. And if you look at some of the original documents of the UN Climate Convention, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, these concepts are reflected in that. There's this concept called common but differentiated responsibility and respective capacity, which, just taking outside of the policy wonk for a second, means that the developed countries, the global north, have a particular responsibility and set of obligations when it comes to climate action. So they must move first and fastest to reduce their reliance on fossil fuels and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And they must provide the financial support to other countries around the world to transition off of fossil fuels. So when we look at just the last 30 years of climate talks coming into COP30, even before, if we look at just the end of 2024, before the Trump administration took power, where were we when it comes to these kind of two hallmarks of whether or not global north countries were doing their fair share of reducing greenhouse gas emissions and providing climate finance. If you're looking at fossil fuels, I mean, the US today is one of the largest producers of fossil fuels globally. And that didn't happen in the last 9 months. That didn't happen even in the last 8 years. That has been something that has happened under successive administrations, Democrat and Republican, that have been fueling and supporting through fossil fuel subsidies, through policy and expansion of particularly fracking in the United States. I know Ali from Oil Change International is here and will be speaking later, but OCI put out a great analysis that showed the US and a few other countries, Australia, Canada, Norway in particular, increased oil and gas production 40% since the Paris Agreement was adopted 10 years ago. So, in the decade since the Paris Agreement was adopted, these countries have not only not reduced their reliance on fossil fuels, but they've increased production on the supply side, bringing more and more fossil fuels onto the market that are going to be burned and going to really reduce the amount of time we have to keep global temperature rise below 1.5, as it's stated in the Paris Agreement. And this is why, the 5S campaign, USCAN, so many organizations on this call have been backing a call, even going back to when the Biden administration first took power, for the US to do its fair share, to not just aggressively move to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions, but to make sure it's providing financial support to the rest of the world in the form predominantly of grants. Right, not loans. And this brings me to my second point around climate finance, right? So in the UNFCCC, earliest, like the UN Convention on Climate Change, there is an obligation for global North countries to provide financial support to the rest of the world. Going into the adoption of the Paris Agreement, there was a goal that was made that by 2020, global North countries, developed countries would aim to be providing $100 billion a year by 2020. And this was a goal that they failed to meet by 2020. They said that they met it a couple years later, but an independent analysis that was done by Oxfam showed that the real value of this, when you take into account potentially double counting, or whether these were in the form of grants or loans, showed that actually the real value of this was much closer to $30 billion a year. So already, in terms of the goals that they said that they would meet in terms of climate finance going into the negotiations last year in 2024, they were already far behind. And it just to spend a moment on this, climate finance and financial support for transitioning off of fossil fuels is a major nexus for these negotiations. As Basav alluded to, so many countries in the global south, to sell them to stop producing fossil fuels is to really put at risk their own development plans and their ability to provide energy security to so many of their own people. So, just suffice it to say, this was a bad situation going into Baku last year, and the outcomes were really, really bad. The fact of the matter is that global South countries were calling for upwards of $1 trillion a year. This was not met. And so we really did see that coming out of 2024 in Baku, there's a whole litany of broken promises and really fraying trust in this global system that was created largely because the US and other global North countries were not doing their fair share. They were not following through on their obligations, whether that's reducing fossil fuel reliance or providing climate finance and support. And in fact, largely what was happening is that they were pushing false solutions like carbon markets, like private sector investment, as an alternative to the public grants-based finance that was being demanded. So, I think I'll begin to just wrap up there and say this was all before the Trump administration came in, took power, and really took a wrecking ball to not just climate policy in the US, but in fact, so much of the global system. We've seen, and I'm sure some of my other panelists will talk a little bit more about the impact that they've had since then. But the tariff negotiations is just one example of how the Trump administration is pushing their fossil fuel energy policy on much of the rest of the world. So we really did see that going into Brazil, there were high hopes with the Brazilian government hosting this for the first time in many years, COP taking place in a country that would allow for outside protests and mobilization, but at the same time, a great gap in terms of not just climate finance, but the action that was needed to be taken to reduce use and reliance on fossil fuels. So with that, I think I'll pause there and I'll hand it back to Vasav.
Thank you so much, Sriram. And one quick housekeeping note is that we are going to have all the speakers speak, and then we'll have questions and answers at the end. So, please hold off on your questions for now, though, of course, be thinking about them. And uh, please use the Q&A feature that you'll find at the bottom of your screen to ask questions. We are using that rather than the chat for Q&A. And with that, I'm going to invite our next speaker, Feleecia Guillen. She's the New Mexico Fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies, and she is also a youth organizer on climate justice in New Mexico.
Thank you, Basaf, so much. And thank you, everyone, for being here and joining us on this very cold December day. As Basaf mentioned, my name is Feleecia Guillen, and I organize with multiple frontline communities in the US, but of course, specifically New Mexico. And in New Mexico, we are fighting every day for a just transition. And what I mean by a just transition is one that completely dismantles the fossil fuel industry, one that rejects false solutions, and one that builds power with those who carry ultimately the greatest burden of extraction. And so this was my first ever COP experience, and it was quite frankly an honor, a privilege, but also an extreme responsibility to not only represent the Institute for Policy Studies, but to also represent my communities from New Mexico. And so this being, my first COP, I personally felt like I was a part of and also witnessed something very powerful. And that was, amidst all the speeches and all the greenwashed panels sponsored by the same corporations who fuel the climate chaos, was that the global people's movement, we showed up. We showed up with clarity, with strategy, with a unified call, and that was that our survival will not be negotiated behind closed doors. And we came ready to expose, to disrupt, and to demand. And we ultimately showed that governments and corporations are not allowed to pretend that incrementalism is enough. And climate chaos is not a future scenario. It's happening right now. It's happening in our communities. And that reality shaped every action, every strategy meeting, every, march we took part of. And it's, in that context that our global movement really showed up super fierce. We showed up coordinated. And, we shared a lot of the same strategy. And, just for some global context, this COP was different for a lot of the reasons that Sriram mentioned. But it was in Belém, Brazil, which is the mouth of the Amazon. And so it grounded us, I think, in many truths that a lot of these negotiators often avoid, which is that climate policy is meaningless if it's separated from the people and the ecosystems that live the consequences of extraction. And so it was this convergence of global resistance from Indigenous land defenders of the Amazon and the Arctic and Turtle Island, to, youth fighting for their survival, to workers demanding a future beyond extraction, that this year the movements walked into COP with an understanding that the political process has failed to deliver the scale of action required. So the people themselves, we have to force a little bit of the action. Across the conference venue, we saw escalations, we saw actions, we saw, the People's March, and we showed that movements ultimately refused to be sidelined. And, there was an alignment between civil society that we have to phase out fossil fuels without loopholes, without distractions, and that we cannot continue sacrificing our frontline communities any longer. And so across these entire 2 weeks, we showed that, we cannot implement the Paris Agreement without phasing fossil fuels, without protecting Indigenous rights, and without rejecting false solutions. And despite recent historic rulings from the ICJ showing that states have a legal obligation to transition away from fossil fuels, that governments continue to stall. But I want to challenge that, because movements, we're not stalling, we're continuing, on the ground. And we showed up, and we have to force the courage that governments ultimately are still unwilling to demonstrate. And so some of the most powerful moments at COP30 were the Indigenous-led actions. Being in the Amazon meant that the world couldn't look away from the peoples who have protected this rainforest, the lungs of the planet, and who continue to resist this extractive violence every single day. I saw elders, and young people calling out colonial structures within the UNFCCC that kept them out of the decision-making rooms where negotiations about their homelands were being made. They spoke truths to power about false solutions, carbon markets, offsets, critical mineral extraction, hydrogen, all of which continue to commodify Indigenous land while failing to stop the crisis. And so their leadership exposed the core contradiction of global climate politics, which is, once again, you cannot negotiate justice while sidelighting the peoples whose rights are at stake. I stood in many actions where Indigenous youth from Turtle Island to the Pacific Islands, to, Indigenous peoples of the Amazon. And it was the same exact story. And it was that these people have survived colonization, resource theft, erasure, and yet we're still here, and we're still fighting for not only ourselves, but for every single human on this earth. And so these, actions reminded me that the entire COP is rooted in, that in this colonial thinking. And these are not solutions at all. These are new forms of extraction that often target the same communities that fossil fuels have destroyed. Outside of the COP venue, however, we saw the People's Summit, which gathered thousands of social movements, unions, feminists, environmental justice organizers, Indigenous nations, climate impacted communities. And so while the world leaders were debating whether they should phase out fossil fuels, the People's Summit became ultimately this beating heart of civil society strategy. And the People's Declaration, made it clear that we reject false solutions. We demand a just transition. We demand a global fossil fuel phase out. And the People's Declaration is bold. We just put it in the chat if you guys want to review it. But it called out the corporate capture of COP and demanded economic and climate reparations. It uplifted community-led transitions that are rooted in public power and care and sovereignty. And it ultimately wasn't just a statement, it was a roadmap and a collective blueprint for how global climate action should look if people, rather than these big corporations and industry, were in charge. And so this declaration aligned perfectly with a lot of the work that a lot of folks on this panel today have been doing in the US through the 5F campaign. Even though the US wasn't physically present at COP, their influence was still felt. It was felt through, the 1,600 fossil fuel lobbyists who were heavily represented. But once again, the real U.S. delegation was the frontline delegation of people from from Turtle Island, Gulf South, youth leaders, environmental justice organizers, and we were there to show the world that the people in the U.S. are organizing a movement strong enough to confront our government's complicity. And we're not just spectators, right? We're strategically positioned inside to pressure points of COP. And so, the United States, as the largest oil and gas producer on Earth, it's really important to recognize that unless we phase out fossil fuels at the source, nothing else matters. And so it was really awesome to be with these people. I had the opportunity to bird dog my own governor, Michelle Lujan Grisham. I, shared my perspective as to why hydrogen energy and other fall solutions being pushed in New Mexico. I laid out the risks. I laid out the risks to our water, to our air, to our communities, to the climate. And basically, after all of that, she said, directly to my face that she disagreed with my analysis. And, this just kind of goes to show you that it was more than just a disagreement. It exposed the gap between political leaders and the people living with the consequences of their decisions. And it revealed how deeply governors want the reputation of climate leadership without actually confronting the industry driving the crisis. And it showed why frontline voices have to be in the room. It's because we speak from lived experience, and because our elected officials will not hold themselves accountable unless we make them. And so to wrap up, when we talk about the global movement response at COP, we're talking also about a shift in power. We're talking about a world where the people most harmed by extraction are now leading the vision for what comes next. I would just say that COP30 did not deliver any sort of justice. It did not deliver a fossil fuel phase out or even language. It did not deliver the scale of action required to keep 1.5 alive. And so, our task now is to bring this energy home, to keep building and to make sure that the next COP isn't a stage for greenwashing, but actually a moment where civil society, can continue pushing this work forward because the world, is depending on us to keep pushing, not with despair, but with determination. So thank you so much, and I'll pass it back to Basaf.
Thank you so much, Feleecia. And next, we have Sheelah Bearfoot, environmental health advocate at Indigenous peoples of the Coastal Bend. Take it away, Sheelah.
Okay. Thank you, Basab, and thank you, everyone else. It was really great at COP30 to be able to work with you all, including like Feleecia on some of the bird dogging stuff. So I guess one of the things that, and kind of the way that I'll be speaking about this is from the perspective of working in Indigenous environmental rights and working with the Indigenous peoples constituency, including the Indigenous Youth Forum, and the ways that while this was labeled as the Indigenous COP, the tokenization and sidelining of Indigenous peoples ended up undermining the results that needed to happen and ended up undermining the results that we as 5F are hoping for. I'm going to start in a little bit of a area that might not be 100% expected, but I did want to outline the feminism part in 5F and how the sidelining of Indigenous peoples ends up undermining that, especially since what ended up getting promoted is a very colonial, patriarchal view of nature as something that can be dominated. And it was absolutely heartbreaking to see Indigenous defenders going in for their land, many Indigenous women leading the charge, being treated like terrorists by the Brazilian government and by the UN. And that is something that is unacceptably shameful and cannot be repeated again. If we want to have a successful not COP, I'll get into that in a second, a successful fossil fuel phase out conference in Colombia, that type of militarized response is a extension of militarized like policing against land defenders that allows fossil fuel corporations to continue extracting and allows mining corporations to continue extracting and basically just allows extractive industries to continue thriving. We can't have climate justice. We cannot have a fossil fuel phase out if there is continued militarized presence. And that is a non-negotiable. So in some of the work I did with the Indigenous Peoples constituency, we were working largely, I was working largely in the Just Transition Work Program, which means we were meeting with individual negotiators, trying to get specific language in the Just Transition Work Program. And while there was how to put this? I hate to frame it as a success because really this is below the bare minimum, treating Indigenous peoples and our rights as something that is necessary feels really difficult to call it a success because this is so below the bare minimum, it's beyond disgusting. However, we had crumbs of our humanity acknowledged within the text, indicating some protection for Indigenous rights. And one of the things that we had been pushing for that has not really been discussed or talked about much is also the rights of Indigenous peoples in voluntary isolation, which basically means that Indigenous peoples who have chosen to not interact with colonial society for a variety of extremely valid reasons are not going to be forced into that. Some of these protections, however, were undermined by continuous conflation with Indigenous peoples and local communities. Indigenous peoples have distinct collective rights as sovereign nations. Local communities, while obviously they deserve rights, do not have the same type of political rights and obligations that colonial governments have to Indigenous peoples as sovereign nations on a nation-to-nation level. And that is something that is being continuously conflated even within some of the texts. And that gets into one of the other issues that we had, which was of critical minerals. So while the critical mineral language was completely cut out from everywhere, and it's deeply concerning since the mining of so-called critical minerals, which honestly, we can just call them what they are. They're profitable minerals. They're capitalist minerals. There is nothing critical about them outside of the colonial gaze. And we are and again, tying in the military industrial complex a little bit more, the vast majority of these are being used by the military. So demilitarization is important even for needing to reduce the amount of critical minerals we like quote unquote need. But in any case, that language being stripped was a huge blow and something that is, I think, a very crucial area of work for both future COPs, other climate conferences, and just, for all of us on the ground, considering critical mineral, so-called critical mineral extraction is something that drives a huge amount of violence, and it's not a carbon neutral source, and it's really just an excuse for industries to continue extracting by another name. The complete lack of fossil fuel phase-out language was something that was incredibly distressing, to say the least. And unless we get some firm language on that, we aren't going to be able to tackle the climate crisis. That's just a non-negotiable fact. And there were certain efforts in negotiations that I sat in on by various countries, mostly oil exporting countries, to classify like oil and gas as transitional fuels. And while I understand that the 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 fossil fuel gluttony of the global north should not end up starving the global south's desire to develop, we still can't we still can't call that a transitional fuel. There needs to be other means of handling this, which brings us to some of the climate finance failures. Last COP at COP 29 was kind of considered the climate finance COP. Okay, 2 minutes left. All right. Was kind of considered the climate finance COP, but but because much was not continued on there, we got a little spillover into COP 30. And one thing we did end up getting was the Baku to Belém roadmap, which is attempting to highlight a pathway to 1.3 trillion in climate finance by 2035, which is a significant upgrade and closer to what is needed, but still falls short. It also falls short because there's not really anything that is forcing developed nations to submit like NDCs, their nationally determined contributions, in a way that would actually meet that. It's all basically a, honor system. We would like for you all to do this. Can you please, stop destroying the rest of the world? And until there's some type of firm mechanism, that's not going to work. So that is one thing that I would hope to see in Colombia. Is I want to see the presence and the energy of civil society continue to grow. I want to see Indigenous rights actually respected beyond tokenized representation. If we don't have a voice in the negotiation rooms, and if fossil fuel lobbyists continue to outnumber us from 1,600 fossil fuel lobbyists to a mere 1,000 Indigenous participants in the heart of the Amazon, we're not going to see progress. So since I probably have about 30 seconds left, thank you all for having me and looking forward to questions towards the end.
Thank you so much, Sheelah. And I want to invite our final speaker, Ali Rosenbluth, U.S. Program Co-Manager at Oil Change International.
Hi, thanks everybody. I really feel so grateful to be here with all of these incredible speakers, but then also looking at the participants here, there are some real badasses fighting fossil fuels on a daily basis that I see. So shout out to you. Thanks for being here to hear about COP. And shout out to all these amazing panelists and for IPS for putting this together. Really appreciate it. So I think I first want to say that I don't think anybody here thinks that the COPs are going to save us, that the Paris Agreement is the solution, rather than it is an important tool that helps the world work together. But where the real work is going to happen and where the real opportunities to fight this crisis and protect people is in our local communities. It's the organizing that we're doing on the streets, in our towns, in our homes, right? And there are tons of local campaigns that are continuing to fight fossil fuels and to make advances in doing so, even under the Trump administration. I like to share that when in my previous job, when I was working to stop the Jordan Cove LNG export terminal, which was proposed in Oregon, we fought that project for nearly 20 years, and it was canceled not under Obama. It was canceled and finished under the Trump administration. There are more projects that can be defeated, even despite this nasty federal regime. And we are seeing that happen. We've seen multiple LNG terminals on the Gulf be delayed already. We've seen investors and insurers pull out of these projects in the U.S., all still under the Trump administration. So while we don't have the federal targets that we're used to in a more democratic administration, there are still so many important things to be doing. And whether you're in a community that is fence line or front line that has fossil fuel or fossil solutions infrastructure threatening it, or you're in a community that that isn't impacted maybe directly by those things, but could do pass policies like make polluters pay or transition off of gas in homes. All of those pieces are still possible for us to win at home here in the US. And another piece that I think really connects deeply to this COP and why I think US leaders go to COP and went to COP this year with the US not showing up is that actually there are an incredible wealth of targets from the US who show up to those to these COPs, right? So Feleecia talked about her governor, Lujan Grisham from New Mexico, who was there, but also Governor Gavin Newsom, who has recently pushed through a bill that is going to open up oil drilling even more in the Central Valley in California, was there saying that fossil fuels was the problem. And so that was also an important chance to hold him accountable to what he's saying in the international stage, the credit he's trying to get, and actually what people are experiencing at home in California, which is very different. We also know that, we have local targets for these projects to stop fossil fuel projects. And also we have international financiers, international buyers, international companies that are proposing these projects in our communities. And so many of those institutions are there at these COPs. And it is an opportunity and that we take on to bring up the concerns with what they are pushing in the US. It's also an important opportunity that we get to really connect these campaigns beyond what is happening in the United States, but to what is happening all over the world because they are so deeply connected. We have these massive supply chains that we can organize at every level at, not just what's closest to us, but we can bring the impact of what's happening in communities to those buyers in Europe or the financiers in Japan that are making this so much worse. So like what's next for the climate movement was what I was asked and I think the answer is in so many of the people who are here listening to this panel right now and so many people who who aren't here who are doing that local work, right? That is exactly what we need to continue focusing on to win, right? The COPs can only do so much. The Paris Agreement is just a tool. It's not going to save us. And one thing that's happening right now that I think impacts a lot of us who are organizing in the United States is this continued attempt to destroy what we have left of a public process for fossil fuel and mining projects. In Congress, the SPEED Act has been proposed and will be up for a vote next week in the House. This strips communities of their opportunity to be involved in public process. It strips tribal governments of consultation rights. It creates massive barriers for litigation of fossil fuel and mining projects when they're approved by the federal government. It is extremely scary. We need to fight it at all costs because, the Trump administration is doing everything it can to fast track and rubber stamp these projects. But now we are seeing Congress double down on what the Trump administration is doing by eroding the laws that we are supposed to be able to rely on, despite what administration is in power. And so I really recommend that folks take action to stop the SPEED Act. I can share an action alert in the chat if that's okay with IPS for people to reach out to their members of Congress. So we can hopefully get the Senate to stop that for good. And finally, I just want to say that we are really in unprecedented times in this country. We are seeing unprecedented attacks on our immigrant neighbors. We are watching multiple genocides be live streamed. on our Instagram feeds. We are seeing the erosion of a democracy that we thought, I think many Americans naively thought would always be there. And we have to, as a movement, be in solidarity with the broader movement. We have to be stopping ICE every opportunity that we have. We have to be speaking out for freedom in Palestine, for end of the genocide in Congo and Sudan, and showing up because we do not win climate justice without any of these atrocities stopping. And so there are so many ways that people have been able to connect climate and all of these things. Of course, there's resource wars that we're seeing unfolding right now, but also if we have any faith in an international system working, a genocide that is unfolding between our eyes must be stopped, and we must enforce a world in which we don't allow these genocides to happen, and international rulings to be ignored again and again and again. Um, so yeah, I think with that, I will pass it back to Basav. I'm again really appreciate so many people who are here, and looking forward to your incredible questions.
Thank you, Ali, especially for leaving us with a note of hope and roadmap forward. So before getting to the audience questions, and I see there are 2 questions already in the Q&A, I do want to ask one follow-up question of all the panelists. So Sheelah, you mentioned this meeting that's going to happen in Colombia next year, where the governments of Colombia and the Netherlands have issued a call for the first ever global conference on a fossil fuel phase out, a subject that keeps getting sidelined from the agenda at the COP. And a follow-up question I have for all the panelists, starting with you, Sheelah, is what role can we as US civil society play in strengthening and legitimizing this conference and making sure that it actually provides a constructive roadmap forward, even as our own government, the US government, will inevitably, and I'm predicting it, and I'm sure I'll be correct, that the US government will do everything in its power, including underhanded bullying tactics, etc., to try to undermine this conference from even happening. And I'll start with you, Sheelah.
Excellent question. So I think one thing that we as US civil society need to do is emphasize that the tactics proposed and diversions and policies proposed by the US government are not reflective of the genuine needs of US civil society. And that's something that I think is going to need to be pushed. As far as managing some of the underhanded tactics that I'm sure the US is going to do, I know that there have been instances, because I've been part of it, with the various civil society constituencies being able to meet with policy negotiators who are have sympathetic viewpoints to what we are pushing for. Like the Indigenous peoples constituency met with Colombia, met with Mexico, met with other nations. And so by bringing our demands directly to other countries, I think that will help delegitimize the nonsense that is being pushed by our current elected officials and reflect and show that this is not at all what the US wants, and that our own people are taking all of these steps that we can to try and ensure it's known that that's not what we want. And then as far as legitimizing the conference, I think that's going to be something that's going to be done in a variety of ways, depending on kind of what our role, basically like what our role in the revolution is. Like, what are we doing more stuff on the ground? Are we in more of a comms, op-ed type position? I think that that's going to look very different for everyone in terms of how they legitimize it.
Thank you, Sheelah. And Ali, would love to hear your response.
Could you repeat the question just one more time to make sure that I really get it?
Okay, so this is about the Columbia Conference. What constructive role can we as US civil society play, even as our government not just doesn't show up, but try to undermine it?
Yeah, so I think Sheilah's answer was really important, that we're showing that there's broad support from US civil society. But I also think, how can we make this a moment in the United States? Like, right? Like, how do we mobilize people around the idea that the world is meeting without us to phase out fossil fuels as the biggest producer and exporter of oil and gas? So I think that there's a lot of exciting opportunities there. I also really wonder, like, will US politicians that love the spotlight of the climate conferences show up? Will we see Gavin Newsom and a big California delegation try to go to the Columbia conference? And how do we not just allow that to happen to be a great media spotlight for him, but to actually result in real changes for communities in California who are on the front lines of the oil industry? So I think that's another important piece. So we'll be continuing to track like how subnationals, aka states in the US, are able to be a part of the Columbia meeting. And I also think like yeah, like how do we bring this story into local communities, right? Like how, again, like how do we make this a moment for people where we understand that the US is is being left out, and is choosing to be left out, right? And that we're falling behind, and that it's up to our communities to make real action, and fill the gap that the Trump administration is leaving.
Thank you, Ali. And we'll go next to Feleecia and then to Sriram.
Yeah, one of like the things that we saw most with COP30 was how fossil fuel lobbyists infiltrated this space. And so something that, I've been working on with BOSSOF is, coming up with strategies and ways we can work with the Colombian government to outright like put a blanket ban on fossil fuel lobbyists and like big tech lobbyists in general. I think we saw how fossil fuel lobbyists kind of did feel this gap of like US presence. And so if I think we were able to outright ban lobbyists from the Colombian conference, I think this would be a huge way to strengthen and legitimize this process. And so I think that would be a really huge outcome if we were able to collectively strategize with partners all across the US, with our global partners as well, particularly our global South allies, and to work with the Colombian government to see if this is possible, because we cannot allow lobbyists into this space to infiltrate and to try to undermine it. So I think that's a huge thing that the 5F campaign particularly will be focusing on in the coming months. So particularly excited about that.
Thank you. And on to you, Sriram.
Yeah, I mean, I think all of my fellow panelists mentioned some incredible things there. I think a couple small things I would add is and I think for me this is a reflection overall of these international meetings, including COP. We cannot win in these spaces that which we have not fought and achieved back home, right? So even if you're not necessarily able to be there, like this is a critical opportunity to raise this message to political leaders at home, the mayors, elected officials in your cities, in your state, to really show them like there are countries that are, as others have said, that are leaving this behind. Fossil fuels it's a 19th century, 20th century energy. Like, we need to transition into the 21st century in a way that's rooted in justice for people, and leaving the fossil fuels of past centuries behind. And I think as we're preparing for elections ahead, I mean, there's no reason that elected leaders should be taking fossil fuel contributions in this time, and that they should not be running on a platform of redirecting those subsidies to the just transition that we need, that is going to put people first. So I think those are critical things, and I think it's worth noting that Colombia relies for half of its exports on fossil fuel. So the kind of political leadership that is coming from the Petro administration and from Colombia in particular in this moment should put global North countries like the United States to shame. I mean, they are being punished by financial markets, and so there should be pressure on corporations, on the financiers of the fossil fuel industry that have even entities like the World Bank that have not put their money where their rhetoric is, when it comes to the policies that they're pursuing and how they're still upholding a fossil fuel economy, despite all indications that we need to be moving off of fossil fuels as soon as possible.
Thank you, Sriram. And it's worth pointing out that the Colombian government is also taking a bold international stand on the genocide in Palestine that Ali referred to. The kind of leadership we are seeing from Colombia on the world stage really should put the US to shame. And with that, there's only two questions, but they're both great questions in the Q&A. And taking them in order, the first question is about the Permian Basin, the world's highest producing oil field, and world's largest carbon emitter, methane bomb. Climate advances in other places are undermined by record-breaking extraction in the Permian. Given the gravity of the Permian's role in big oil solvency and US geopolitical power, and the fact that it's one of the biggest obstacles to phasing out fossil fuels in the US, why do you think this place is rarely mentioned in US climate spaces, and communities in the Permian are also notably absent from climate justice spaces? And I'm going to go to you first, Feleecia, since you're from New Mexico, which overlaps significantly with the Permian.
Yeah, thank you so much to whoever submitted this question. From my perspective, communities in the Permian have been kept isolated by design. Industry controls the economy, they control the politics, the media, they control the jobs. And I think jobs is like a huge emphasis there. And, I work very closely with the frontline EJ organizer who does live in the Permian Basin, and, kind of just uplifting her experience, like speaking out can literally cost you your own livelihood. Organizing in the Permian is quite dangerous. It's under-resourced. And while, New Mexico and Texas share the Permian, New Mexico relies on oil and gas revenue, whereas Texas is run by the industry itself. And so the result is that people who have been most harmed by extraction most often have the fewest platforms, the fewest protections, and the fewest opportunities to be in these like national climate justice spaces. But it doesn't mean, that they don't matter. I think it just means that, quite frankly, that the rest of the movement has failed to show up for them and has failed to like bring them into these spaces. And that's the core of this issue. It's that you can't have climate justice in the US while ignoring the place that is driving the crisis. And we can't talk about phasing out of fossil fuels without confronting the Permian. And we also can't build a just transition while entire regions like the Permian are politically abandoned by the rest of us. And so, yeah, I think this is like not a niche issue. It's the front line of the global fight against fossil fuels, and the movement really has to start treating it that way. Because if we're serious about climate justice, then lifting up the Permian, lifting up its communities, its water, its land, and most importantly, its workers. This is not like an optional thing to do. It's like the threshold, and it's where ultimately the US climate movement, will be decided. So that's just, yeah, my perspective.
Ali, I'll go to you next since I know OCI has done some great research on the Permian.
Thanks. Yeah. So we do have a website that is called permianclimatebomb.org or .com. I'm not sure which one. It's a bit out of date, but it does go into our research and just how massive of a climate bomb the Permian Basin, the extraction in the Permian Basin is. I think, yeah, Feleecia answered that question spot on, and I want to like majorly plus um, what you just shared. I also want to say just like an interesting thing that I've noticed, something I've noticed recently. The more we are working with European colleagues, especially on gas exports, the more I've recently just heard much more of them like bring up the Permian climate bomb as something that they're really concerned about. And part of the reason why they are working to stop the EU from buying and financing US gas is because they understand much of that is coming out of the Permian Basin and understand the significant consequences of that. And I think like there is so much more work to do to connect uh, this organizing to what's happening on the ground. But there are some incredible organizations like Oilfield Witness, for instance, who are starting to make those connections. And yeah, like how do we like in this situation, like how do we go after these international targets that have in places that have started to socialize the idea of the Permian Basin climate bomb, like really being a massive wall to climate action all over the world. So that's a little bit I'll add to Felicia's great answer. Yeah.
Thank you, Ali. And in the interest of time, I'll now move on to the next question, which I will direct to the two of you, Sriram and Sheelah. And the question comes from John Kavanagh at the Institute for Policy Studies. And it says, I saw that after the failure of government to commit to action at the end of COP, that the Lula government committed Brazil to embracing a just and planned energy transition that would lead to the reduction of the country's dependence on fossil fuels. And what did your Brazilian allies think of this? And do they think that Brazil can lead the way in addressing the climate emergency? And I'll go to you, Sriram, and then to Sheelah.
Sure, I'm happy to take a first crack at that, and Sheelah can come in and I think fill in the gaps where I might have some blind spots. But I mean, I think I would first of all start off by saying I think it's laudable to see this sort of leadership starting to be really explicitly discuss the role of fossil fuels here. I think that's again a result of all of the pressure and a global movement now that we're seeing 80 plus countries that were calling for this roadmap. I think there's more to be done there. I think we saw a lot of global north countries that were saying, oh, we're in favor of a roadmap to phase out fossil fuels while still not doing enough to reduce their reliance on home. But I would love to see a global competition or like a race to the top in terms of climate leadership, where some of these countries are trying to outcompete one another. Colombia is holding an international conference to phase out fossil fuels. Brazil is like, what can we do to improve this? Now, let me come in with, some of the concerns that I have here. I think right before COP happened, we did see that Brazil was opening up, I believe it was exploratory licenses for oil and gas drilling in the Amazon basin, which is extremely concerning. As Sheelah was mentioning, a number of our indigenous relatives who were there were showing up, were protesting, among many things, oil and gas drilling, but not just that, the role of the agribusiness, in particular soy and beef industry, that is impacting their territories. Where in some cases this is illegal logging or operations that's being undermined, and really undermining the sovereignty of their own territories, resulting in all sorts of violence against indigenous and land defenders in these communities. So I think, the announcement is one thing, but the real work is in the implementation and how the communities on the ground are incorporated, integrated, and their role and sovereignty really respected in the process of moving this forward. I will say, just to echo what Sheelah brought forward, it was disappointing to see the extent to which this was a extremely militarized space. More than a few times, there was not just there were at least a couple actions where indigenous communities really put their lives on the line, with support from civil society in that moment to make these concerns heard. And I think we're seeing that this is not just this is not an aberration. It's an ongoing concern with the constriction of civic space and the ways in which frontline communities are put in harm's way throughout this process. So I think the devil is unfortunately always in the details. But I'll pass it to Sheelah to come in and speak to maybe some things that I didn't touch on there.
You touched on a lot of good stuff, Shriram. Basa, would you mind please repeating the exact question?
Sure. So after the failure of government to commit to action at the end of COP, the Lula government committed Brazil to embracing a just and planned energy transition that would lead to the reduction of the country's dependence on fossil fuels. What did your Brazilian allies think of this? Do they think that Brazil can lead the way in addressing the climate emergency?
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, I feel like if we're talking about, in particular, like Brazilian indigenous protectors on the ground, the skepticism is high. Brazil has one of the highest murder rates of indigenous land defenders, not just in South America, but like globally. It is one of the most dangerous places to be a land defender. And while that is not entirely under the control of the Lula government, it is a backdrop that is incredibly important to consider when we're seeing whether or not they're going to be able to phase out fossil fuels. I mean, a couple of weeks before COP, there was a new deal by Petrobras, like Brazil's state-run oil company, to continue doing more drilling in the right next to the Amazon. So there's been kind of a mismatch in terms of rhetoric that is coming forward and actions that have been taken in the recent past. So I have some of my skepticisms, and I don't think that this is going to be an achievable goal until all the representatives of the Amazon tribes are able to be at the table with an equal voice and have just as much legitimacy as other sovereign nations that the UN recognizes.
Thanks. And Ali, definitely, you can definitely add one thing.
Yeah, I just wanted to just also add this little bit of context of like the politics in Brazil and that they have an election coming up where our allies are incredibly worried that Lula can win again. And Brazil, similarly to the US, has a very strong right wing as well. They are holding their right-wing politicians more accountable than the United States has, with Bolsonaro actually ending up in prison while we were at COP, which was a great thing to celebrate. Um, but I think there was also a big worry of the outcomes of this COP and what Lula, how strong the Lula administration was going to look and what the implications of that would be for the election. So I just wanted to add that into all of this analysis. I totally agree with. But that, like, I think that there's worry looking over at the US and seeing Trump win and then Trump lose and then Trump win again, that there could be a similar 180 to a far right leadership. So my conversations with Brazilian partners like Observatorio do Clima was that the next couple of months, the like implementation of this and bringing the left together in Brazil, which is like very different than and very more strong and organized, I would say, than the left in the U.S., bringing all of them together to fight um, for keeping power is very much top of mind. So I just wanted to add that to everything else that was shared as well.
Thank you, Ali. And that brings us to the last of the questions we have received. And I'd love to hear from all four of you. The question is, what is the role of people who might not consider themselves part of the climate justice movement? And I'll go to you first, Feleecia.
Yeah, I think, if you don't consider yourself part of the climate justice movement, you still have a very vital role, and that's to show up where you already have power. You don't like have to self-claim as a climate justice organizer. You don't need to become a policy expert, or give a speech or join an organization in the morning. You just need to be willing to protect what you love in places that you are already in, that you already belong to. So if you're a parent and, you're worried about your child's future and heat and a polluted air, that's climate justice. If you're a worker who's demanding safe working conditions, fair wages, this is climate justice. If you're a student who is questioning, whose future is being sacrificed, this is climate justice. If you're a storyteller or an artist or, cultural worker, your ability to shift the narrative is climate justice work, and so we don't necessarily need people to recognize that climate justice is fundamentally about dignity, it's about safety and the right to thrive, and every community has their own role in defending those things. And we also need people to be brave enough to break silence and to talk about what's happening, even when it feels overwhelming. We need to call out false solutions, and we need to show up for frontline communities whose experiences are, too often ignored. And so, yeah, you don't need to call yourself an environmental justice organizer to be part of the solution. I think you really just need to decide and to recognize that your voice matters, and that you can have a role in the movement, even if it's a small one.
Thank you. And I'll go to you next, Sriram.
I think Feleecia captured it so well, and I just add there's no small roles in the movement, right? We need this work really does take a village, And I think I would encourage you to, start by really, as Feleecia is saying, connect into the things that are affecting your community. I mean, right here where I am in Montana, one of the things that we're seeing is, and I'm sure is happening in many of your communities, is a massive build out of data centers, right? And these are not just issues of democracy and community, but these are issues that are connected to climate as well, because we're seeing some of our utility companies bring on massive amounts of fossil fuels. Or in some cases, hydrogen that is linked to fossil fuels in order to power these. Like here in Montana, Northwestern Energy, our utility, will bring on 1,400 megawatts of power for 3 data centers, which is just mind-boggling, right? This is as much power as 1 million homes would use annually. And so I think that we're seeing that there's whether we like it or not, there's a transition that is happening. But the question is really, and what so many of us have been fighting for, is to ensure that justice is at the center of this conversation, whether that's at COP or whether that's in our communities, and that the decisions for what our future looks like, or our present and our future looks like, are not made without the people who are most affected on the ground. And really at some level that includes all of us. So I'd encourage you to connect with the groups, and communities locally, and find what are those issues, and how can you get involved. And you may make some incredible friends along the way as well. So it is really about finding that community and support network.
Thank you. And going to you next, Sheelah, and then to Ali.
Their apologies about that. Um, yeah, I'll just echo that there are areas where everyone can contribute. And I think one of the things that um, is important and not really experienced enough is we're not uplifting the voices of frontline and everyday folks who are living with the brunt of these issues. And by not giving those voices respect, we are continuing to center and give a skewed perspective of what the issues of climate change actually are by centering those who are impacted the least. And then giving legitimacy to qualifications that aren't really qualifications in the first place.
Yes, Ali.
Yeah. First off, I think you probably are part of the climate justice movement. But I don't, if you're thinking about like your friends or your cranky uncle who you're gonna see over the holidays, one thing I think about a lot, we think a lot about at OCI in the United States, is the amount of social services that we lack, like healthcare, the cutting of food stamps that we're seeing happening, the cutting of children who are able to go to Head Start, which it has massive impacts on every single American. The United States federal government gives about $34 billion a year to the fossil fuel industry. They're subsidizing it with billions of dollars that could be going towards things that would actually benefit people's lives. And that's not money that's going into like helping you pay your energy bill. That is the money that's going into subsidizing extraction of fossil fuels. So just calculating a little bit of what that could go to otherwise, we could, with that $34 billion a year, we could provide 3 million family SNAP benefits. We could put 54 million, or we could put solar panels on 54 million households within a decade. So there's money that is not going into the things that people need, that is instead going to line the profits of the oil and gas industry, of not everyday workers on the rigs to the CEOs, and that every American should be concerned about where their tax dollars are going, and the fact that we don't have we don't have a healthcare system. We're losing the subsidies that we're going to affordable healthcare. People are losing their food stamps, and every single person in this country, whether or not they care about climate, is impacted by the money that is going to that industry instead of actually supporting people in a good quality of life.
That brings us to the end of our webinar today. And I want to conclude with a huge thank you to all of our panelists. We appear to have lost Sheelah. She may have lost her connection. But huge thank you to all our panelists for joining us and sharing your wisdom and your insights. And I also want to thank everyone who took an hour and a half out of their Thursday afternoon to engage in this super important conversation. And with that, bye everyone. Thanks for joining and have a great rest of your day.